Hello, welcome back for Coach's Corner. Today we're talking with Mike Leonard, the head coach at Middlebury Baseball, and we're going to be talking about effective coach communication, some things about recruiting timing, and then also some leadership development and culture given Coach Leonard's background. So, the intro, Coach Leonard. Coach Leonard is the head coach at Middlebury, now in his ninth year with the Panthers. In his time there, he's seen a lot of success, both as a team and with individual players. Twice NESCAC champions, once NESCAC runner-up. Twice, Coach Leonard was named NESCAC Coach of the Year, set a program wins record with 32 on the year in the season of 2024, went to an NCAA regional final in 22, NCAA regional in 2023, and has had two players named NESCAC Player of the Year, four players named NESCAC Pitcher of the Year. Before Middlebury, Coach Leonard was the head coach at Bates, and before that, coached at Elms College and St. Lawrence, and also a wildly impressive player. As a player, Coach Leonard was the 2000 Connecticut Gatorade Player of the Year, went on to play his college ball at UConn, where he was twice selected All Big East, and is still in the Huskies record books as top 15 in career hits, RBIs, and games played. After UConn, Coach Leonard played in the Red Sox organization from 2004 to 2007, up through the AA affiliate Portland Sea Dogs. Coach Leonard, thank you for sharing some time with us.
Yeah, thrilled to be here. It's weird hearing all that information. I think it just ages you. The longer that list gets, it just is an example of how old you are, maybe not how esteemed you are.
I think in this case, it might be both, but your SID is doing a great job highlighting some of the successes. So I love to see it. Awesome. So to dive in first on coach communication, this is an area where we get a lot of questions from players. And so I love to kind of talk to coaches and get their take, kind of direct from the folks who it impacts the most. So when you think about communicating with prospective student athletes, kids that you're recruiting during their recruiting process, what are the primary channels that you're using? And does that change? For example, does it start on email and move to text or phone calls kind of as you develop? Like, what are the channels that you're using most often where you want to talk with players?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start with towards the end. I would say phone calls and video calls. That's way towards the end of the process. I think at times we get kind of initial requests from players right at the beginning, like, "Hey, I'm interested in your program. Can we hop on a Zoom call?" And like with the amount of just time that everybody's dedicating to life and recruiting and other parts of the job, I think it's just not possible to set up Zoom calls with thousands of prospective students. But once it's moved to a place where there's been back and forth communication, I think the end of it will be that video Zoom call, or phone calls are more frequent. In the beginning part of it, I think email is super appropriate. I think that's a really easy way to just make an introduction. It allows us to kind of like send that initial kind of response and let the prospective student know some of the key parts to our process, right? Which is usually involves filling out our questionnaire so that we know demographic information. We're able to collect some of that academic stuff, what schedule, the player has for the summer. We can share our schedule, and it allows kind of that player to be in our system when we're sending our stuff out too. If we have camps, if we're updating our recruiting calendar. I think the middle part of it, there's a lot of different things that happen in that middle place. And I think this is where it gets challenging for families and prospective students, right? It's like, how much email communication? Should I, coach's cell phone numbers in the email? Can I text them, right? Like who's on their social media? Is it appropriate to send a direct message and, all that stuff. So there's some nuance to it. I don't think there's like a blueprint. I say this all the time. Like every player's, pathway to a college program looks a little bit different. So it's not this, if you do step A, then it turns into step B, and then it moves forward here. I think there's some players that we, only correspond with through text. We barely email with them, so it's getting really late in the process. We've met them in person and we're like, "Hey, I don't think you filled out our questionnaire," right? There's some other players where we know their coaches really well. So like we know a ton about them and have had like a lot of conversation with their coach and are familiar with their program. Sometimes there's an alumni connection. So it limits like the volume of exchange of emails, texts, phone calls, because there's just quite a bit more background to the player and the relationship. I will say that one piece that becomes critical for any part of a recruiting process to move to another level is there has to be some form of like an in-person meeting, right? There's very rarely a case where it's an email communication that results in a phone call that then moves the process somewhere. That there has to be that face-to-face conversation, using kind of the language around, an interview, if you will, but it's the player's opportunity to kind of interview us. What do they think about our philosophy, our style, who we are as coaches? How does the institution fit for them? And then for us to get to know what that player is all about. And I think that is critically important for prospective students to understand. We want to be very selective with who we invite into our program, and that opportunity to meet, to connect, to talk is their opportunity to kind of tell us how our program will be better if that player's in it. And if they're not prepared to be in that space, it leaves me with a lot of questions. And there are no shortage of players out there that have an interest in playing college baseball. So the talent will be important, but I think that relationship, the character, the personality, the fit is critical. And I think that usually involves an in-person meeting.
I think that's one thing that we certainly, kind of believe and feel is really important. That in-person conversation, does that tend to be like on the recruiting trail at a tournament or a showcase? Does it tend to be on campus? Like, is it when they come for the prospect camp? I know it's probably a mix, but like, what do you typically see? Like, where do you, I assume you also probably want to get kids on campus to, see the beautiful field. And like, that's a compelling point to get them to come, right?
Yeah, I would say it's all of it, right? So we're doing a lot of, camps and showcases. So we're there, we're coaching players, right? And we want to see, how are they coached? How do they respond to coaching? What are they doing in the dugout? How are they communicating with other prospective athletes? And how are they engaging, in those relationships? And then, yeah, for sure, we'll have our own prospect camp, which is great. Like, it's more time. It's on our campus, so that gives us like a lot of like a depth of connection with players. It's a little bit deeper than going to some other events where there's just like larger amounts, and it's harder to do that. And then I think that for every player that there's a strong interest from us in, right? If we've kind of identified them as a strong candidate for our program, we definitely want them to visit campus. We certainly understand that we are a place that requires some planning, and it's not just hop in the car and drive over to Middlebury. So we appreciate the investment that folks make to do that. And that always means something in terms of like indicating sincere interest. But I think it would be very hard for us to move to the end of the recruiting process without having that player visit campus. And I think that's that really important time of those critical questions around, all right, if we're looking at three first basemen, right, that interview piece is going to be really important to who is the best fit, provided the academics, the athletics, like everything checks the box for all three candidates. It ultimately comes down to fit. And it's a mutual fit, right? I'm realistic to know that we're not a match for every student. And that's great to know that ahead of time rather than, have them get here and be like, oh, what did I get myself into?
Middlebury is also it's a phenomenally beautiful campus, beautiful facilities. Like it's a highlight to go there and visit anyway.
Yeah, no doubt. It's always a good trip, and I think certainly worth seeing all around.
Yeah. So going back to email for a second, one question about the email. So email is going to inform a lot of, it's going to kind of play a leading role in kind of coach communication, especially early on, as you touched on. I want to kind of frame it as a stop start. What is one thing that you want players emailing you to stop doing? And what is one thing that you think they should start doing or do more of in their email communication with you and with college coaches?
Yeah, I think the stop piece, I would just encourage prospective students just to look really closely at the volume of emails that they send, right? If it is a biweekly email update, if it is just like every other week with hey coach, I'm playing at this field. Hey coach, I went 2 for 3 last night. It becomes overload, right? There's no way to reply to all those in an authentic, sincere way. And at some level, there's no way to really like look at that information with a lens that is valuable, right? It's too much. So I would encourage folks just to kind of like be thoughtful with that. Be thoughtful with like who they're sending that stuff to. I think there is an appropriate, if I've shown the same level of engagement where I'm asking a prospective student, like, hey, give me an update on your game. Like, how did things go? Hey, I saw you played this team. How did you do? Right. That's probably like being initiated from us, and I think the reciprocating that is appropriate when there's nothing coming the other direction from us, and it's just like email after email after email after email. It starts to kind of like have a negative impact on the player. And then in terms of like, what players can start doing, I think, just having that baseline core of critical information is really great to have, and I think that's like, certainly after the junior year, what does the transcript look like? Who are the coaches that are people that if I pick up the phone and call, they're going to have a really good understanding of who you are right now and how you've developed into the player that you are. They can talk about you on and off the field, and certainly some type of visual, a video, or a link to kind of their, recruiting, profile or whatever. So as long as we have like that kind of core information, the next step is really kind of out of the player's hands at some level. It involves us seeing them and meeting them in the process moving forward. But I think emails at the very beginning, absent that information, make it hard to then circle back because, things pick up some speed over the summer. And I think that's where it becomes really hard, where you've got an incomplete profile on a kid who emailed you in January. Now you just went to, head first and saw, 300 players. It's tough to go back to that kid in January who didn't send you a video, who didn't send you a transcript. You're not familiar with the high school, and keep them front and center.
The things to include in that, it sounds like, are video or update it with video when you do have video, transcript, most up-to-date transcript, test scores if you have them. And interesting additional piece that I hadn't heard quite as much is, coach name and contact as kind of a reference check. Is that
Yeah.
more or less a full slate of what they need to make sure they include?
Yeah. And then certainly when they get a response back and we say, hey, thanks for your interest, please complete our questionnaire. That's
Yeah.
not just like, that's actually a step that's important,
Yeah.
because that's how we communicate with students moving forward. It's how we communicate with our admissions office. It's how we keep things organized. So I think players' inability to do that, hurts our ability to keep track of them.
Yeah. Fill out fill out their questionnaire.
Yeah, it
All
doesn't
right.
take much effort.
Yeah. Moving on a little bit to recruiting timeline, and I know, like as you said earlier, and as I think we certainly all agree, it is very much an individualized process, and the communication is different, the timing can be different depending on the player. At a program like Middlebury, with such high level academics plus high level Division III baseball, that has to play such an important role in the recruiting process. What do you generally see in the timeline of the players you recruit? When are they first getting on your radar? When are you moving through the process with them? And then when do you start to say like, yep, this is the guy for me. I'm gonna work next steps. I'm gonna get him on campus, that kind of stuff. Like, what do you generally see as the timeline moving through, whatever, sophomore through senior year?
Yeah, I think the longest window is like that general, identification or initial interest phase, right? And that can be anywhere from, in rare instances, the player's freshman year of high school, right? More likely than not, sophomore summer into their junior fall. That's like that initial identification. Maybe they made an unofficial visit. Maybe we saw them at an event, but there's at least something there that kind of sparked interest on both parties, right? So you kind of have that initial identification that can continue through, into the fall at sometimes, right? There's some players that we've ended up, moving forward with as recruits who we met and saw for the first time in the fall of their senior year of high school, just because of, any number of circumstances. So that's the longest window. Once we've kind of like learned enough about the player as a person, as an athlete, maybe they visited and we have their transcript and we've been able to go through and make a full evaluation, nothing will happen in terms of like moving forward with them as a recruit for our program until after July of their junior year, right? So that kind of July to late October is usually our window for kind of making decisions and communicating with players around, recruited opportunities here and things of that nature. And it's not always kind of a straight line. There might be somebody who's in that pool. We've done that identification, but a decision hasn't been made. So it's kind of this, hey, we'll let you know, right? You're in the mix for us. And we're working through like our list. They're working through their list of schools. And that's happening July and August and September. I think the vast majority of our recruiting decisions are made between kind of August and October. in some instances, there's players that we know a lot about, they know a lot about us, and in July might be the right time, but it certainly won't be earlier than July. And I do think that like every single year and every single player is different for that.
And I think that that is a key thing to, to caveat it with is like, okay, if Coach Leonard's seen you play 4 different times since you were a sophomore and you've already been on campus for an unofficial visit, like that timeline might look more like July. Whereas if he sees you for the first time in June, maybe it's more like August, September. And I think that I really, really like and appreciate the way that you phrase that. Like there's this identification window that overlaps with some of these decision windows as well, right? Where you might see a kid in August while you're also maybe committing other kids that you saw summer before or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think like players should also know, like, we don't always get it right, just like they don't always make the right decisions. Right. And I think there are plenty of really talented players that have gone to other schools, maybe in our league or just other places that for whatever reason, like our timing didn't line up quickly enough with theirs, or we missed an evaluation or an opportunity to evaluate. And like their decision window was closing and we just weren't in a position to kind of like reciprocate that interest. And there's certainly players we've missed on. I think where I really try to be cautious and really, really careful and thoughtful is when we do make decisions on players, is making decisions on the right people and making sure that like at the end of the day, they're going to really support the incredible culture that we have here. And luckily, not any player that's been on our roster, there's no regrets. We've had, a ton of really, really incredible people come through our program. I love every one of our players and every one of our alums. And I think we've hit on all of them as people. And, obviously the performance, I think we've been in a pretty good place the last couple of years. So I think we're doing a good job, but it doesn't mean that we're perfect. It doesn't mean we don't miss. It doesn't mean there aren't talented players who we misevaluated or didn't evaluate early enough that go other places. And that's just kind of the nature of the game sometimes. And I think the opportunity for players to kind of like continue their process is really key, because we run into that a lot. Like, you'll have a player that's ready to make a decision on Middlebury and we say, hey, we're not ready to make a decision yet. That's an opportunity for them to go look elsewhere. But we're also in that boat with some kids. Hey, we're ready to make a decision. We really like you. We think you'd be a great fit for us. And they're like, yeah, not quite there yet. So it's happening in both parties and in both ways. And it's just kind of the nature of the beast.
That would be a very good segue into some of the questions about culture. I want to ask one kind of follow-up question around the timing. You mentioned like, okay, potentially rising sophomores, but more likely rising juniors and rising seniors are kind of getting on your radar. If you see at a showcase or at a tournament, you're looking at a mix of rising juniors and rising seniors. Are you looking at evaluating and engaging with them differently depending on like, okay, this rising junior I'm looking at in one way, this rising senior I'm looking at with kind of a different set of lenses or a different set of filters?
Yeah, there's definitely more urgency with the rising senior. Just you're closer to the reality of making a decision. I think that sophomore, the reality of it for us is if they're really, really talented, they're going to have multiple options as they continue to develop and move forward. So we certainly want to let them know, hey, we'd like to be one of your options. But I think that they're sitting in a pretty nice position as a, younger high school athlete, knowing that they've got some college interest. And I think for them, it's more about kind of like how they grow, how they develop, what do they end up, using as their criteria for making their college choice. So we certainly will let them know that there's some interest, but there's not the same level of urgency as there is with a rising senior who's approaching that window of making a decision and getting to that college choice.
On to kind of like leadership and culture. So one thing that I learned as I was prepping for this, Coach Leonard has an MEd and an Ed D in like education, like focused on leadership, heads up the student athlete leadership program there at Middlebury. So, and it's come up in the conversation, right? Cultural fit and thinking about how you're kind of developing these kids and who they are on and off the field. What are some of the core values that you emphasize in your program to build and maintain kind of that team culture that you're looking for, and how does that kind of work through the recruiting process?
Yeah, so we start with kind of like an overarching framework of be accountable, be committed, and be different. That's kind of like our program ethos, right? And I can break down each one of them. And the accountability piece is just kind of like owning your part in whatever you're involved in, right? So kind of looking inward first, looking in the mirror first. If you're, unhappy with current set of circumstances, what are some actionable steps you can take to respond rather than kind of the reaction of blaming external forces or going from there, but just kind of like owning, your own part in things and being really active in that. Certainly the accountability piece to the game, to your coaches, and also to your teammates and then yourself. So really trying to highlight that. The commitment piece is all about that investment and doing hard work. I think that, the idea of playing college baseball for a high school athlete, they can kind of wrap up that idea of what college baseball is into what they maybe see on social media, um, or how they've framed it in their head. The reality to a bus ride, to a 6 a.m. lift, to walking across a campus in the snow at 5:30 to get to that 6 a.m. lift, to eating dinner after practice and then having to do a paper, and some of those realities, like you do a lot of work, it's hard, and we see that as like being committed to all of the things that are part of being a college athlete, not kind of having it be like a buffet and you can kind of pick and choose what you want to do. You have to do it all well. And we want players to be totally invested and committed to anything they sign up to do. That includes their classes, that includes like their relationships, and certainly includes all the parts of being a college athlete. We very much frame our program as you're a college baseball player, not an academic Division III baseball player, right? And I think people can kind of like label each differently, but the big overarching umbrella of what it means to play college baseball involves a lot of investment and sacrifice. And then the be different piece is just all about like, define kind of what the easiest pathway is. I think, humans by nature kind of like want to take, the easiest pathway to get things done. I think average is kind of like where people gravitate towards, and we're kind of always trying to like break out above that, whether it's the way that, you respond to something that's hard. Here is the most common way to respond to that, right? Like this is what everybody does, right? They want to give up, they want to get mad, they want to quit. What's the harder thing to do? What's the different thing to do in that situation? Certainly applies to little things like handling the weather, right? It's pretty different to play baseball when it's really cold and snowy. Two teams have a choice on that day, and we want our players to kind of make the different choice, not the easy choice to say like, it's cold, I don't want to do this. And we try to wrap that into more than just being a baseball player, right? I think at the end of the day, I view myself as an educator. I think baseball is my opportunity to kind of like connect with students. College is going to be a 4-year opportunity for growth and education, and baseball is super important to them. It's a great opportunity to learn how to, handle adversity, to, really see if you can develop yourself as an athlete, as a person, as a leader. So the game creates all these awesome opportunities. But I think the educational piece goes beyond that. So as we think about, the ways that you communicate, the opportunity you have as a student athlete, the opportunity you have as a male student athlete, just to kind of like be, a positive change to things, right? Kind of defying that, like, athlete being, caring more about sports and not enough about school, or like not being a good, ambassador on campus on a weekend and making certain choices. I think our message to our players is always about like, how can you change that narrative and move forward and be different in those situations and not be kind of like this worst case scenario, poor stereotype of a male student athlete, and be able to do things in a really positive way.
Part that be accountable, be committed, be different. I really like that. I sometimes there's some overlap in kind of how programs view culture, or that kind of, that motto or whatever it is, that credo. I hadn't heard that one, so it is different. You're embodying that third one, certainly. I love that.
Yeah, my players would probably take it another level and just be like, we're just different because we're goofy and we're funny, and
Sure.
they get to live into it in their own way too. And I would say
Right.
that's the important thing with team cultures, right? Is like, I'm a constant in this program, so like those values will stay constant, but our team personnel is going to be different year to year. And I think the identity of each team and how our leaders go about kind of, leading the team from the player perspective, that changes, right? And I think there's always kind of that guidance that comes from me, but the end of the day, my days of, throwing a ball and hitting a ball are long gone. So the performance of our team is going to be in the hands of our players, and they have to own their part in our culture. I get to set those program standards. They're allowed kind of that freedom to kind of create that, individual identity to the team each year.
So that's a fantastic window into the culture of the program and kind of how that works, how you approach it. What qualities do you look for off the field in a recruit to kind of to think about how they're going to embody that culture? Like what are the ways you're looking for? What are the intangibles, and how are you assessing that as you engage with recruits?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest one, and sometimes it like sets players back when I ask them, and I'll ask them flat out, like, how is our team better with you being a part of it? And it's this aspect of like, players are really good at telling the story of what they can do athletically, right? Oh, here's what my bat speed is. Here's how hard I throw a baseball. Here's how fast I run a 60. Here are my stats. They're not as good at telling the story of like what kind of teammate they are, or how they would handle, different roles on a team, or how is the team stronger, right? So getting players just to kind of like really look at their why to being a part of a college team, right? And it certainly can be, my why is I want to be the best, shortstop you have ever had, right? I am motivated to be really, really good at the game, and I'm going to work really hard, and that's great. Um, Combining that with a why of I really want, depth of relationships. I want to play with, a group of people that like I care about and they care about me, and we're going to, work through kind of like these really big challenges together. And this individual team game that baseball is really kind of fun, where you have all these individual moments, but it's so interconnected, right? So the way that one person responds to a challenge is going to have a trickle down effect on how everyone else responds to that. So trying to raise that bar with, how people approach everyday mundane things like showing up and warming up, and what does that look like, and what are the conversations like, how willing are players to kind of build depth of relationships and really ask questions and get to know one another. That to me is really, really important. I think recruits who have kind of a lens around leadership and leading others, and where leading others becomes challenging is that influence, and sometimes that like peer to peer, not confrontation, but like holding peers accountable. I think that the common way people will talk about their leadership, with prospective students is, well, I'm a lead by example, right? I do the right things. I work really hard. I'm the last one in. That is the floor of leadership. That's like the baseline piece to it. Building from there to actually lead and bring people with you and influence, is to sometimes like, have to step up and say something in a situation. Sometimes it's having to confront somebody who's your best friend, right, in a really challenging way. Sometimes it's not enough for you just to do your thing. You also have to bring people along with you to do that. And I think that's something that we try to like pull out in the recruiting process. We've had players that we've really looked at as recruits, more so because of how they tell their story about leading, and how they articulate their desire to be a part of a team, and what type of teammate they would be. Even if we felt like their athletic piece was, maybe lower than some other players, just about every single year, there's someone in our recruiting class that we identified as like, hey, I really think this player is going to make our team better from day one. And throughout our roster, you can see all of them working together, and it's great when you have senior captains and junior leaders and sophomores and first years all kind of in that space. Now you have a thread from top down, and that's where you kind of get that really strong cohesion and strength on a team.
That feels like a great place to wrap the like kind of the thematic one, the questions. I got a few lightning round questions
All
meant
right.
to be that we ask all the coaches we talk to, and they're meant to be, first thought that come to mind, short response. What is a question that recruits should be asking more in the recruiting process?
Coach, what's your coaching philosophy?
I love it. What's the pitch to a recruit you're interested in to choose Middlebury? What makes Middlebury unique?
The relationships that they will build with the coaching staff and their players, I think is something that I have control over, and and something that I put at the forefront of how I run our program and develop players. It's a relationship driven sport, right? It's not, automated yet. So there's always going to be that human aspect to it. So I think
Yeah.
connecting with teammates, connecting with coaches.
What's an off-field action, habit, or interaction that stands out to you and gets a kid's name highlighted when you're out recruiting?
Um, Joy and energy, I think, would be both, simultaneous. You kind of see someone who enjoys what they're doing, and just like bringing pace to it. Can't overstate kind of like the energy piece to
Yeah.
moving around a baseball field. It's a
Yeah.
slow game, but if players are not bringing energy, it's slower and more boring.
And what's the number one thing you look at first in a potential recruit? You see someone on the field and you're like, I'm looking for X as a quality action, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've talked a lot about kind of like, personality type stuff, but I'll get right to, I mean, athleticism is something we really look highly at, and athleticism takes different forms. Some players are really fast, some change direction, some can really move a bat. Just like the way that they are able to move and throw and hit. Do we see an athlete there that we feel like we can make into an even better college player? That's just kind of the piece that we look for. So there's like a speed, explosiveness, power combination that each individual can bring in their own way. There's different types of athletes, but we certainly look for athleticism above all else.
Thank you so much for spending some time with us today and talking through. Really appreciate the thought, the insights, all this incredibly great information for prospective student athletes.
Awesome. Happy to do it.